For his part, Constantine, having enshrined the church as the spiritual voice of the empire, proceeded to place many restrictions on the Jews. Feasting with the Jews, keeping the Sabbath on Saturday, or conversion to Judaism became offenses with strict penalties. The Jews also lost the right to live in Jerusalem, and were stripped of other rights common to citizens of Rome. The situation for the Jews worsened during the Middle Ages, times when their unique traditions were more of a curse than a blessing. Two vicious lies were spread about them during this period, that of host desecration and blood libel. Host desecration was the belief that the Jews during Easter would raid churches and stab communion bread in an attempt to recreate the crucifixion. Blood libel was the idea that the Jews would kidnap and kill Christian children, whose blood would become an ingredient in matzahs, bread used for the Passover Seder meal. Both lies were propagated by the Church in Europe and raised at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. The Middle Ages were characterized by two major anti-Semitic disasters for the Jews. The first was the Crusades in the 11th to 13th centuries. What began as a quest to rid the Holy Land of Muslim infidels became as well an opportunity to persecute non-Christian infidels everywhere. As the Crusaders marched across Europe on their way to the Holy Land, tens of thousands of Jews were evicted from their homes, and many of those were killed. When the Crusaders finally reached the Holy Land, they showed no mercy.
The 20th century gave birth to a new theological term, which really has its roots many centuries ago. The term is replacement theology. Simply explained, it is that because the Jews, generally speaking, rejected Jesus of Nazareth as their Messiah, God the Father then rejected the Jews. The logical extension of that is that the church has replaced Israel in the plan of God. Now, of course, we can look at Israel today and see that God must be at work to have brought this nation out of the ashes of the Holocaust and brought the Jewish people back from their dispersion back to the land of Israel where they rightly belonged. But we find the concept of replacement theology even in the writings of the early church fathers and down through Christian history. It'll surprise many Christians to know that when the Christian crusaders made their way here to wrest these lands from the pagan infidels, on their way they persecuted many Jews. Jews were expendable. When the crusaders finally reached Jerusalem, history records that they rounded up Jews into the synagogues, locked the doors and set the synagogues on fire, and then the very next day celebrated Holy Communion, the Lord's Supper, believing they were doing God's will, God's work, because after all, the Jews had rejected Jesus, so God had rejected the Jews. They were no longer needed. When we understand that replacement theology, which suggests the church replaced Israel in the plan of God, has existed down through the centuries, virtually since the time of Jesus, we can then understand how the Holocaust came to be. Because Adolf Hitler argued that the Jews were expendable as well. Yesterday I visited Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial here in Jerusalem, which commemorates the systematic extermination of 6 million European Jewish men, women, and children. 1.5 million children. In the company of people with whom I was with, there was a Dutch lady who has been out of Holland for a very long time, but she remembered being a little girl, and she remembered the image. It brought everything back, and she burst into tears. And she was weeping for the people of Israel. I noticed in Yad Vashem a reference to Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, which means my struggle, and a quotation in which he says, "If you want to see the personification of evil, of the devil, you need to only look into the face of a Jewish person." This gave rise to a hatred to the zenith of anti-Semitism that became the European Holocaust